Trying to think of something smart to say, but nothing comes to mind. So I can just say hi, yeah. So I see Gerald is online, Ryan, so I'll bet Gerald's not feeling well too. And, see Linda. Oh, wow, you guys are gonna, wow. I don't, George, I kind of always assumed, George, you sat in the corner so you could kind of doze off and I wouldn't see it, so. I know Gregor's still not feeling good. I know we got a good number that have been sick and coughing and all sorts of stuff. So a lot of folks like that. So let's get our Bibles out. Let's go over to 1 Samuel or 2 Samuel. How about 2 Samuel? Chapter 8. 2 Samuel chapter 8. Boy, I wish Gregor was here because everybody says online that when Gregor says a prayer, it's, everybody can hear it really well. So that's where I need him back with us. So I hope he's going to get better soon. Before we go going, though, we'll go ahead and have a word of prayer. So let's bow our heads and offer things. Holy God and Father, we give thanks to you for having a few minutes of time in the middle of our week, that we could gather together, that we could study your word and consider the things about the nature of your servant David. And tonight, Father, as we consider, too, a brief lesson about Mephibosheth, Father, we realize that this is an application for us. And we pray, Father, that we might be those that sit at your table, given this grace from you. Father, watch over us as we continue in this week. And in the name of Jesus, we pray. Amen. So where we were last time, we had picked up and David had just gotten this covenant made with God. Kind of the high point. I guess we could kind of say these next couple of chapters are also kind of the high point because it's kind of going to go downhill after this. We know what's going to happen, right? You're probably all familiar. And by the way, last week somebody said that, hey, Brian, we're not always all familiar with what we're going into. And always ask questions if I throw out a name or two that we're not familiar with. But next week, we're going to be talking about Bathsheba and how David is going to commit adultery with her, how this is going to begin a series of events that's going to just wreck David's home. And there's just such an important lesson there about the consequences of sin that we want to get into and spend some time with. But we're not there yet. We're still at the high point. But part of this high point is Israel's surrounded by a lot of enemies. They've got all sorts of nations all around them. And those nations have, for a long time, caused problems. For the last, let's say the last 80 years, who have been the big problem for the Israelites? Philistines, very good. The Philistines have been the worst. They've been the real problem. Now, in times past, in the book of Judges, we had all sorts of people causing problems. We had people as far away as Mesopotamia, and we had, of course, our friends the Moabites, and the nations all around them. But by and large, the Philistines have been the big problem. Philistines have been the ones that have caused the most trouble. So David's got to deal with them, but he's going to deal with a whole bunch of nations that have been causing him problems. In fact, as we pick up in chapter 8, the first thing we read about is that David attacks the Philistines and subdues them, and he takes the cities from them that they had possessed. So kind of get a sense here. Let me get my clicker fixed. Just a second. So we get a sense here of how it is that David is progressing and slowly taking over these different places. David's going to conquer the Philistines. Verse 2. He'll defeat the Moabites, forcing them down to the ground. By the way, what did you think of this when you read this? Forcing them down to the ground, he measured them off with a line. With 2 lines, he measured off those to be put to death, and with 1 full line to be kept alive. You get what he just did? How many of them did he kill? 2/3 of them. Now, I'm going to guess it probably pertains to the 2/3 of the army, or maybe even the noblemen, but it's still a pretty violent action. And we talked last week about David and why God said, you don't get to build the temple. And we said part of that is because David, well, you tell me, why was it? What kind of guy was David? Yeah, a man of bloodshed. And I kind of see a little bit of that right here. And I can't help but to suspect that there's probably a lot of times where David went in and a lot of people died by the time he was done with his conquest. So that's just a really difficult truth. As we move on, though, it goes on to say in verse 3, he defeated Hadadezer, the son of Rahab, the king of Zobah. Kind of interesting, by the way. Anybody look up Zobah? Anybody say, where is Zobah? Yeah, it's somewhere up north, but we're not sure where. There's a lot of different cities that it could be, so we don't know this one for sure. Where is Zobo? Not completely sure about that, but Zoba's way up north, and I want to kind of get a point about this. He's going to take from them 1,000 chariots, 700 horsemen, and then what does he do to all their chariot horses he leaves behind? He hamstrung them. So what does that mean? Yeah, so basically they're no longer useful, particularly for war. And I don't know if they actually I don't know if they're good for anything after that, frankly. But to Ham, if the Van Fleets are here, we'd ask them if there was anything they could do after that. But honestly, it might just mean that they were good for nothing after that. But so that might be part of the problem there too. So he does that. Now, when the Syrians of Damascus show up, he verse 5 says he kills 22,000 of them. And he puts garrisons up here, and he takes all these different cities. He takes gold, he takes bronze. It just kind of goes through a list of all the different things that he is talking about. Now, according to chapter 8 and verse 3, how far north did he go in his conquest, Stephen?
Well, in verse 3, it does say river, which I took a look at, so that's the Euphrates.
Yeah, some of our translations add the word Euphrates just because the river is always the Euphrates River. So David's kingdom looks something like this. It's pretty big. And like I said, this darker red area would kind of represent the best that Saul had. So when you look at what Saul had versus what David had, it's nearly double. Now, by the way, one of the biggest areas that it takes here, it's not on this map, but right in here is in a real important city. What city? Paul was going on there one day on a trip, and Damascus. Damascus is one of the most important cities around, and he'll take it. Stephen?
This is really significant that he went up to the Euphrates because that was a promise to Abraham by God. I will count you so they see have given us land from the river of Egypt unto the great river of Euphrates.
That's a really neat point, Stephen. I appreciate you bringing that to us. So this was part of that promise. And typically, Stephen, I a lot of times they'll make kind of a mention of it with Solomon, but I didn't even think about it. But that's a great catch, that this was part of that promise that was made to David. Now, by the way, except for one brief time, I want to say it's under Omri, they'll never really be quite this big again as a kingdom. But this is really substantial. This is really impressive that his kingdom stretches this far. Now, Solomon's really going to secure these places. Solomon's going to really keep them down. All David really kind of does is just defeat them in battle. But then Solomon's going to establish the cities and such up here. So he's going to really settle things into this area. But I like to look at maps. Like I said, it just kind of helps me to get a sense of things and what's going on in the world. And as I said, this is really a significant kingdom that David is now establishing here. Now, we go on here reading about these things, and we go to verse 13. David made himself a name when he returned from killing 18,000 Syrians in the Valley of Salt. He also put garrisons in Edom. Throughout all Edom, he put garrisons, and all the Edomites became David's servants, and the Lord preserved David wherever he went. Now, here's a question. Whenever he took over the Moabites, what did he do? Wiped out 2/3 of them. But when he took the Edomites, it doesn't seem like there was much of any bloodshed. What do you think maybe that was? Really, a little bit of speculation, a little bit of going back further in the Old Testament, a little bit of maybe some speculation too. But what do you think? Oh, go ahead, Debbie. You were going to say it, weren't you? Yeah, they're the brother nation, they're called. Now, what about the Moabites? Are they related? They actually are too, because the Moabites are descended from Lot. Very good. So Moabites are descended from Lot. So they are kind of a kin nation, but the Edomites are a brother nation. Sometimes God calls them brother. And one of the things is we even, when you go through the prophets, you see a lot of times the prophets go to the Edomites too. So Edomites are an important nation. Not a great people, by the way. They have a bad reputation, but because of their kinship, because God made them some promises and gave them some inheritances. I would suggest maybe that's probably the best reason why it is the case that they were like this. Now, as it finishes up, it begins to tell us how it is that David administers his kingdom. And I, like you said, sometimes these details might just kind of seem, uninteresting, but I always think they're interesting, especially since these are all people that we want to know because they're going to come back. So it starts off by telling us who the commander of the army was. Who is that? Joab. I really want to talk a lot about Joab because he's such an interesting guy. Maybe not tonight, but we will be talking about him. But what kind of things would you describe that you know about Joab so far? Go ahead, Stephen. He's ruthless. He's ruthless. Yeah. And we remember how he killed the guy that killed his brother, even in a city of refuge. So he's pretty ruthless. What else? We haven't really got here yet. But the other thing about Joab that I always think is striking is he's loyal. I mean, he's loyal. He's the kind of loyal that David doesn't like. Loyal. He's going to cause a lot of problems for David because he's going to think, well, David, sometimes you're a problem to yourself. I'll take care of things. Kind of loyal too. So these are some of the characteristics. Whenever David was talking about Joab, what does he say? Earlier on, a couple of weeks ago, we talked about this. Do you remember? How did he describe his control over Joab? Yes. So, and there were three of them, and of course, one of them is died. But when we go back and we consider that statement that he made about what happened there, he's basically describing the idea that they're just uncontrollable, that he just has no control over these men, and they are something else. Joab's an interesting guy, like I said, without a doubt. He is really, really an interesting guy. So, so the next question is, we kind of looked at all these different roles. We had Joab as in charge. There's this Jehoshaphat who was recorder, not the Jehoshaphat that's king later on, by the way. But it kind of made me wonder, anybody know what the recorder is? What's a recorder? What do you think, Stephen?
State officer, high rank, chancellor, advisor of the king.
That's an interesting point, chancellor. It's a very important role, but it's obviously a role that we wouldn't have in our government anymore because this is a guy who every day, what does he do? Sits down in the king's chamber, and 8:05, king ate his breakfast. 8:50, Joab came, and he sits down and he writes all these things that happened. Stan throws online here. He says the rememberer. That's kind of a neat term. Rememberer of Israel during the reign of David. So he's the guy that's writing down. Some translations say the chronicler too. So he's the guy that's writing down everything that's happening all the time. And that's kind of interesting because that kind of helps us to know where later on, whenever maybe it's Ezra or others are kind of putting together the accounts of these lives, that there's going to be some mention of some of the chronicles that were written down. So kind of nice to know who was writing that. Of course, then we have the priests, Zadok and Abiathar. And so the question is, who's the high priest? Anybody have an answer on that one? Say it again. Abiathar. So George, why do you think that? Now it doesn't say that, but George, your guess is good. Why? And we'll be careful to say Zadok was left too, but why Abiathar? Because who was his father, grandfather? Who was his ancestor? He is a descendant of whom? I think you said Eli, but I can't tell. Yeah, well, you said Eli, I guess. So he's a descendant of Eli. He's the great-grandson of Eli. We'll find out a little later on. And by the way, when Abiathar meets his, not end, but his removal from office, there's a statement that makes it clear to us that this connects itself back to the curse against the house of Eli. So he has a connection to the house of Eli. So our presumption is, and it'll never say it though, is that Abiathar must be the high priest. But it's possible the second alternative is perhaps there's no high priest at this point. Since nobody's ever spoken of as the high priest, it's very possible that while you've got a couple of priests here, you may not have any high priest. Stan agrees with you. Stan points to Abiathar too as the one seen there as high priest. Now, I've got one more question, and I'm not sure if this was really a very fair question, because I got to thinking, you might not even have an interest or care. But there's a weird thing about the end of verse 8 where it says that David's sons, and most translations render the term as chief ministers, but the word is actually priests. Anybody look into that? Like I said, we might just even skip over it, only because while it's interesting, it might not be that important. But the term here says that David's sons were priests. Now, anybody have any thoughts about that? So go ahead, George. Uh-huh. So George, there's one of two conclusions we make. Number one is they couldn't have been priests. And since there doesn't seem to be any kind of, they were doing something they shouldn't have done. Because later on, when we have been appointed as priests that shouldn't have been priests, God very much says you shouldn't do this. So that's the presumption. The second one is, well, they shouldn't have been priests, and they were, and they shouldn't have been. But the way the language is used, it seems to be the case that it's not. Go ahead, Lamar.
We're talking about the same two, and it says chief ministers at the king's side. So that may help a little bit to say that they were ministering or serving kings or serving.
Yeah. So, and it's interesting, a little later on in 2 Samuel, we'll have the only other time where that term is used, where the Hebrew word, which is Cohen, you hear a lot of people, Jewish people today with that last name, it means priest. The only other time in the Old Testament where it's used, and it's not translated as priest, is used as those two close counselors to the king. So that's a really good point. Stephen? One last comment. Stan makes a comment about this. He says, well, some commentators suggest that this is, or some suggest that this is a foreshadowing of Christ as the high priest and king, Just so you know, it's just kind of an interesting thing to bear in mind that this was an unusual little moment. But as I said, maybe not something that we want to spend too much time talking about. Go ahead, Lamar.
Just that comment, verse 17. It talks about Sariah was a scribe in the King James. So I'm just curious. Earlier we had this person that reported.
Mm-hmm.
Here we have a scribe, and some footnotes say that the scribe may be more of a personal secretary to the king, where the reporter was actually reporting. This king came to visit and promised this or said that or whatever. So that could be fine.
That's kind of neat, Lamar. I actually didn't think much about it, but when you say it, I'm thinking, yeah, that scribe position would be interesting. And of course, in the New Testament, what did the scribes do? Yeah, they wrote the law. They were always writing things out of law and such. So I don't know if that has a connection to this, but we usually infer the idea the recorder is just making notes of things, but the scribe might be the formal communications, the secretary, things like that. Teresa, do you have something? No. So that's as good a point as any. Lamar, that's an interesting observation. I don't have, I should have looked into that one a little more too, to see if there was much of a language. We also talk about Ezra as a scribe, but he's more like a New Testament scribe, I would suggest. But that's a really interesting point. Linda Van Fleet throws one little comment in here, by the way. She just says, in the King James, it calls them the chief rulers or the chief princes instead of the ministers. That's just kind of an interesting little tidbit there. So the big thing I want to talk about tonight is chapter 9. In chapter 9, I know I've done at least one lesson on this because it's a neat story. Chapter 9, here's David, and he's just kind of overcome his enemies. He's got one more to go, and that one's going to be a while. So he's overcome his enemies, and he's looking around, and he says, is there still anyone left of the house of Saul that I may show him kindness for Jonathan's sake? This is kind of interesting because there probably are a few more people that are of the house of Jonathan or the house of Saul, because we're going to see something happen at the end of 2 Samuel where some of the house of Saul are going to be executed. So one thing is Michal, David's wife, has children that are theoretically descendants of Saul. But so what do you think he's looking for specifically? What would you guess? What do you think, Ryan?
Jonathan, he may have had a wife still, but it looks like she's dead over
Yeah, it's interesting. So I think he's probably looking for someone who is a descendant of Jonathan in particular. Jonathan. So I think that that's kind of interesting. Now, we know Saul's sons have died because 3 were killed in battle. The 4th was killed by some men that thought that that would please David. So now he's looking around and he's saying, well, is there anyone left? So they find one of the servants of Saul. I want to say he was the chief servant, but now I don't see it. So I'm just going to say a servant at this point. And what was his name? Ziba. And by the way, remember this guy, because he'll come back in a little while. In a few chapters, we're going to visit him again. And there's a real enigma about the kind of person he is. And so David calls him in and says, Ziba, I'm looking for anyone left, verse 3, of the house of Saul that I could show kindness to. So Ziba says, well, yeah, there is, but who is it? Jonathan's son. I want to hear you guys say the name. Mephibosheth. Mephibosheth. It's quite a mouthful. Mephibosheth. But he says, well, there is a son, but what's the issue? He's lame. Now, question number 1, why was he lame? What happened? If we go back, we read about what happened back in I think it's chapter 2. Go ahead. So they were carrying him and they dropped him. And it's just a little tiny footnote in the account about what happened here. And he was dropped while he was being carried, and he is now crippled. So I kind of wondered what kind of wound that would be that would cripple somebody, that would, a break in the leg that would cripple them. And, I don't know what to say. Stan reminds us it's the story that the child's nurse heard the news, and this is the death of Saul's sons. She picked him up and fled, and she dropped him. He became crippled. Like I said, to me, it's kind of interesting what might have happened. Ryan, do you have a comment? The back? Oh yeah, well, and I didn't even think about that it could have been a back injury, because I was just kind of thinking like dropped on his feet and his feet hobbled or something like that. So I don't know. Monique, do you have a comment? No. So Ryan, that's interesting if it could have been a back injury of some kind. But the thing is, he does have children. So I don't know to what degree that would have affected that. He does have a son. What's the stigma? What's the issue here? The way Ziba says it, it's kind of like, well, he does have one, but he's lame. What's the story in Leviticus 21:18? George? Yes. So somebody who was lame was excluded from the worship of Israel. It's kind of interesting. We're going to talk a little bit about this Sunday that, one of the other things was if you were a eunuch, you were excluded. But to be lame, you couldn't present yourself before God. Stephen? So was this God being unfair? Was this God being unfair? I would say, yeah, a little bit. I mean, it's kind of unfair. But at the same time, what was it really meant to accomplish? What was it really talking about? It really wasn't about them, was it? Purity. Yeah, it's about spiritual purity for us today. We can't approach God if we're impure, is the idea. Go ahead.
Even their animals for sacrifice have to be pure.
Yes.
Limited to just people.
So when I hear Ziba making this statement, he is, there's this one, this lame, it's kind of like, and by the way, I'm reading into it. You don't have to agree with this, but I almost wonder if Ziba's saying, well, yeah, there's one, but you don't want to mess with him because, yeah, he's kind of one of those people that's, he's just, a beggar, whatever, doesn't tell us exactly what he is. But the point is, he's not much. It sounds like he's saying here. He doesn't see much here. So the king says, oh, hey, where is he? And well, he tells him where he's at Lodabar. So So he brings him from there, the house of Machir, the son of Amiel, and Lodabar. Now, verse 5, at least, maybe again, it's kind of hinting at something. He didn't bring him from his own house? So what might that indicate? Stephen?
Well, I get the impression, I was reading something about this, and it said that when Mephibosheth came to David, he was expecting to be killed, and fell on his face and paid homage to him. In other words, he was loyal to Saul, and because of that, those people who were loyal to Saul expected to be executed. And so bringing him before the king on certain command.
That's really neat. A real neat observation, Stephen, that really could be you're being brought before the king. That can't be good kind of thing. Especially when, how well do you think he knows about his father's relationship with David? Why not? How old was he whenever his father died? Yeah, he's 5 years old. Stan has it too. 5 years old whenever his father dies. So, I just don't imagine that necessarily he has this sense that my dad and the king were best friends, the closest of friends. So it might be the case that, just like you said, he doesn't know what's going on. One thing I was kind of wondering about, though, is that not living in his own house, again, is indicative that he just has no substance, and that's interesting to me because what do you know about Ziba? What does it say about Ziba in verse 10? He has 15 sons and 10 servants. So I kind of wonder here, and again, I'm kind of I'm going this direction because of something that's going to happen a little later on. We're going to have to come up with a decision about Ziba. We can't just leave him alone. We have to figure out what kind of guy he is because of something that's going to happen a little later on. But the point is, I get the impression that maybe Ziba isn't exactly thrilled that somebody takes an interest in Mephibosheth, that might not be to his benefit. Now, again, it is purely speculative. And Stan's kind of leading up to what's going to happen in a few chapters when Ziba goes to David about Mephibosheth and tells him this story that we're going to have to decide whether or not it's true at the time because it's a big deal. But the point is that Ziba might not have been thrilled to have this come up to say, I want to find him, bring him to me. So David brings him in, and Stephen, your comment's really neat there, that here's Mephibosheth brought in, and I'm your servant, here I am. And David says, don't be afraid. I want to show kindness for Jonathan, your father's sake. I'm going to restore to you all the land of Saul, your grandfather, and you're going to eat bread at my table continually. Go ahead, Teresa.
I get the impression from verse 8 that he probably hasn't been treated very well, and he's accepting that.
Why would you look at such a dead dog like me, and that is interesting. And Teresa, again, that's what I think too. I think here's a guy, he's crippled, to be restored all the lands of Saul indicates he doesn't have any of the inheritance of his grandfather, that maybe he's living in somebody else's house. There's a lot of things that are pointing to the fact that Mephibosheth has had a rough life. Now, again, I'm reading into it for sure, but I think that there's a lot of good indications that that's exactly what's going on. Now, what's so interesting about these promises David makes? He says, number one, going to restore everything in Saul's house to you. Why is that significant? What do you think, Mooney?
The successor king take over?
Yeah, so number one, it should have been the case. And by the way, there'll be a comment a little further on about Saul's concubines having been given to David by God. So some of those things did go to David, but you think all of those things. But David's saying, going to give them all to you, Mephibosheth, number one. Number two, what else is he going to get? Oh, he's going to get Ziba. That's right. I was even thinking about that verse 9, he calls Ziba and he says, this is your master now. And again, I'm reading into it, but I just wonder what Ziba thinks of this moment and especially when it gives us the footnote that, Ziba was a pretty well-to-do guy. So I'm wondering about this. But Ziba says, to be fair, verse 11, I'll do everything you said. But what is the second part of the promise? I wasn't thinking of Ziba. I was thinking, what does he say you'll get to do? You're going to eat at the king's table like a son. But David's adopting it, effectively. David's saying, you get to come and you get to be at the table with me. You'll eat bread at my table always. Wow. And again, in case we missed it before, the chapter ends by saying, oh, by the way, he's lame in both feet. You got that, right? He's lame in both feet. And David just adopted him. David just adopted him. Now, we'll try to come back to this because this story is so full of such a spiritual weight of a concept of the adoption of grace. But let's go ahead and finish up in the next chapter so we can come back to it. So let's jump to chapter 10. Chapter 10, we come now to the king of Ammon, Ammon, and Hanun, the king of Ammon dies, and his son Hanun takes his place. So David's thinking, yeah, I'm going to show this guy some kindness. You know, he was good to me once. I'll be good to him. He sends his messengers out there. But verse 3, Hanun's advisors are saying, hey, this is no good. This is bad news. What has David been doing to all the other nations around? Well, let's take a look at the map, okay? Here are the Edomites. And he did what to them? Made them his servants. Here are the Moabites, next one up. And what did he do to them? Killed 2/3 of them. Way up above, that's the Damascus and the Syrians. So here's Ammon, you know. And they send messengers. And his guys are like, hey, you know, the guys south of us and the guys north of us, David has just wiped everybody out. It's no good for us. No good for us. So what do they do to David's messengers? A very interesting kind of thing. Verse 4, they cut off their garment, exposing their nakedness. They then shave what? Half their beards. These guys would have fitted in Portland very well, I think, at this point. But this act is really something, you know, what they're doing here. So Hanun, you know, completely shames these guys. This is a big deal. In fact, it's such a big deal that David tells these guys what? Don't come back till, you know, you're growing back. Not out of cruelty, by the way, probably out of mercy to say, look, you know, I know you don't want to come back. I know this was a huge sign of humiliation, huge sign of humiliation about these things. So the Ammonites here are basically going to declare war. Hey, by the way, I was just kind of looking around the Ammonites, found something I thought was kind of interesting. Here's an image of one of the Ammonite kings from about this time. The archaeologists dug up. And I thought, well, you know, they had big feet. I don't know what to say. You know, it's you look at a statue like this, you don't know what to say, other than it's just kind of interesting whenever you see little things like this about these people that we're reading about here, and you're thinking, you know, whoever the king was, he would have, you know, had this statue in his home, and you know, this would have been something that he looked at. Now let's go back and talk about the Ammonites for a second. Who are they descended from? Also from Lot. Very good. The Moabites and the Ammonites are brother nations. So that's a good point. So there's a kinship there to a degree between these people. Now, David had actually wanted to show kindness to him, not because of that kinship, because he says, though, that because his father Nahash showed kindness to him. So remind me what that was. What had Nahash done? What do we remember? Going back, go ahead.
All the Israelites or people in what city, they have to put out the right line, and everyone else, but it was an extraordinary humiliation.
Yeah, against whom? Not David, right? It was actually, this was when Saul had just been made king. So what is the kindness? And the answer is, we don't know. We don't know what the kindness was. We don't get why David is saying this. There's no story that says, Nahash did this. The only thing we know about Nahash was when he said, I'm going to take you guys over and I'm going to pluck out your eye. And, you know, he really was not a great guy. But one of the things I kind of think about is the amount of time that spaces it out between all these events might indicate that Nahash was kind of reckless young. And as he got older, he calmed down after being defeated by Saul. So that's an interesting point.
I was reading something where someone's quoting Josephus, implying that Nahash, the extended kindness of David some years later, must have been a son or a successor to the Nahash defeated by Saul. In such a case, the name Nahash may have been a title bestowed on a series of persons, like the titles of Abimelech, Pharaoh.
That's a great point, Stephen. So Stephen's observation is it's very possible we're not talking about the same guy, that it could be a son or something like that. And by the way, you're gonna, the name Hadad, we're gonna run into so many Hadads in the Old Testament that you're just gonna, they're all gonna run together. There's as many Hadads in the Old Testament as there are Herods in the New Testament. So, you need people to come up with new, unique names. That's what we needed. So it could be the case that this is not the same person, but whatever this kindness is, we're not told about it. Now I had suggested, I kind of already hinted at this, why were they afraid of him? And I had said, well, if we look at the map, we get a good sense that David has conquered everybody else. So I think that the princes, their advice, might not have been the worst advice, but it was bad advice for sure. But it might have had a little bit of reason to it, at least, to say, hey, David has beat everybody else. Now there's kind of an interesting thing I was thinking about though. Whenever David's messengers show, they take them and they go through verse 4, this exposing them and shaving half their beards, but they didn't kill them. And I got to thinking about that. I thought, well, why not? If you're gonna strike out, why do this kind of strange thing instead of just killing these guys? Anybody have a thought about that? George? What's that? So what are they thinking, George? So George's observation is maybe this is meant to be a limited provocation. No blood for blood, perhaps, but if we just kind of insult him and send him back, David will know we're not going to be tricked by this. So, that's kind of an interesting thing to think about. Anybody else have a thought about this? So I don't know. Like I said, why not kill him? Well, it might have been too that the insult was worse than injury. It could be as well that this kind of insult was really, meant to be kind of derogatory. Well, of course, the Ammonites realized, though, I like your term there, they rattled the tiger's cage, and, pulling the tiger's tail. That's the other expression I hear sometimes. They've just done it, and they kind of figure this out. So what do? Who do they call to help them? They get on the phone, the ancient phone. Who do they call? Yeah. Now, by the way, it's not impossible that these battles are kind of overlapping each other. But they call the Syrians, not the Assyrians, the Syrians. And the Syrians, why would they be ready to help David? And you just said it. Yeah, David took a big massacre of them. So these are guys that are maybe chomping at the bit for a fight. So so they're going to draw this out. So if we jump a little bit ahead, who's going to die in this battle? Reading a little further on in 2 Samuel 12 and verse 9. Yeah, one of David's mighty men, a man named Uriah. This is going to come important for us next week. So just kind of keep that plug. Jumping a little further than that even, what is it that Nahash's other son, Shobi, does in 2 Samuel 17? Anybody look that one up? What do you got? Yeah, so he actually takes care of David, interestingly enough. And yeah, so kind of interesting, by the way, that just this little connection that the other son is actually going to help David. He's going to support David and take care of David. So I've always thought it's kind of interesting to kind of put these people together like this. I've got 5 minutes left. Let's go back, unless anybody has any other thoughts. So let's go back and let's talk a little bit about Mephibosheth. Let's talk about Mephibosheth. Oh, go ahead, Ryan.
Is there any chance that there was any sort of evidence of true religion among the Ammonites?
What an interesting question, Ryan. As far as, and you're kind of thinking of maybe Shobi's kindness to David. So, Ryan, what do you think? So was there any trying to think of how we could look at this. Yeah, and he's a Midianite too. So Midianites and Moabites are kind of the same group after a while. That's kind of a confusing thing in the Bible. Who else was a Moabite that was pretty good? Very good. Ruth. So we have Ruth, and and that circumstance too. So there does seem to be at least some people that figured it out. So Ryan, I assume you're kind of going the direction of saying, well, maybe Shobi is, a man who fears God, and that could easily be the case. Can anybody think of any Ammonites that feared the Lord in the Old Testament? I can't think of any, but I'm just wondering if anybody can remember one.
Lot, of course.
Well, Lot, yeah, their ancestor, yeah, that's true, righteous Lot.
I guess the son, his name was son of Lot, from by his youngest daughter, was born to the Ammonite king, and then Ammon was his name. So,
That was that son of Lot, you said. Yes, yeah. So I don't know what kind of guy he was for sure, but that's very interesting to think about. Ryan, that's a good question. I'd be curious if anybody found somebody, an Ammonite that was regarded as righteous. That would be interesting. Let's camp a little bit on Mephibosheth. So one of the things about Mephibosheth that's so interesting is Mephibosheth is somebody who is prevented from appearing before the temple. We talked about him being lame and such. Now, when David reaches out to him, what are the connections here that relate to us in grace? What kind of things do you see there? Go ahead, Stephen.
I have a little bit of a list here.
Yeah, no, please do. Please do.
So we are basically like Mephibosheth. We are hiding, weak, lame, and fearful before the king comes to us. We're separated from our king. We've separated ourselves from the king because he didn't know him or his love for us. We must receive the king's kindness and humility. The king returns to us more than what we lost. There's all this here.
So Stephen, you're really pulling some good things out for us to think about. Number one, we're in a position where we can't appear before God, in sin. As Mephibosheth couldn't go before God at the temple, we can't go before God because of sin. Number two, whose credit was it that Mephibosheth's blessings came? His father, somebody else's. Yeah, somebody else's kindness, somebody else's credit is why Mephibosheth is receiving this benevolence, this incredible thing that he's given him. In fact, you could say he's receiving a kingdom, because the third thing I always think of is it's an adoption. He's being adopted. Can David heal him? Does David heal him? You'd say no, but one of the things that one preacher pointed out to me, says, but when you think about it, everybody's sitting at the table. You think of all David's son Amnon and Absalom, they're all sitting at the table and sitting there with Mephibosheth. And what are they sitting at the table? What's Mephibosheth's, what do you not see? Yeah, so in a way, his lameness is gone. I mean, it's, kind of symbolic. When he's sitting at the king's table with everybody else, they're all sitting at the table, and that lameness isn't even visible. So kind of it is taken away in a way, too. It is taken away there. And he's going to be promised to, specifically, David says a couple of times, what is he going to receive the rest of his life at the table? He's going to eat, verse 7, he's going to eat bread, and I always think of the story of the bread of life. Mephibosheth is just a really neat concept of grace, of how it is that somebody can be adopted based on somebody else's merit. They can be given these blessings. They don't expect it. I liked what Stephen said earlier about the fact that showing up, you'd think maybe the king's actually going to put you to death, because that's the inheritance you might deserve. But the inheritance that he's going to get is that he's going to instead receive everything back, plus he gets to be a son of the king.
I don't know if it would make any difference, but his humility probably would play a part in it as well.
I would think so. Yeah, I would think so. And by the way, I can't help but to think maybe Mephibosheth is really saying, why would you give all this to me? Maybe you missed the lame feet, but why would you do this to a dead dog like me, Monique?
I was just thinking too, just inside pure speculation, but thinking about the fact that sitting at David's table, he may get some answers to those questions. And why are you showing me this kindness in the relationship that David had with his father, for him not knowing his dad that well?
Wouldn't that be a neat story to sit down and say, Mephibosheth, let me tell you about your dad, the dad you never knew. Let me tell you about why he was one of the greatest men of Israel. That really is a neat point. Stan has a neat point. Stan says, this is a big message of these 3 chapters regarding the Lord and his kingdom. What Jesus does is the anointed is call for the outcasts, outsiders, lame, the rejected to enjoy his kindness. Jesus is telling the world that he wants to show good to everyone. And Mephibosheth is just such a fantastic way of showing that. And it's just a really neat story. Teresa, and then we'll wrap up.
Well, and he got the same blessings that his sons did, just like the Gentiles did. The same.
Yes, you get the same blessings as though you are a complete heir. And of course, for us, that's a lot more significant too. So that's a great point to consider. We'll stop here. It's all bad news starting next week. It's going to start going bad. It's going to get worse and worse over the next preceding weeks. I'll be missing for a couple of these classes, so I'm glad to get to leave that and leave it with somebody else here. So I remember who we have teaching that. I'll have to double check who's going to be covering that material. But yeah, pointing over at Anthony, right? So we'll wrap up there. Thanks for really great comments tonight. I really appreciate it.